Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Dorman. I serve as the Community Engagement Coordinator here at the Princeton Public Library, and it's my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's author talk with the fabulous phenom, Connie Escher. I'm not allowed to say very much. I could write a book treatise on every year she taught, but that's as much as I'm going to say. I want to start by thanking you all for joining us, both in person in our community room and virtually on Zoom. I am told we have people coming from as far as Brazil. This event will run for about an hour in total, and there will be an opportunity for audience members, both in person and virtually, to ask questions. My colleague, Dana Treichler, will be monitoring the Q&A functions to get questions for our presenter. And those in person can simply raise your hand and we will bring you the microphone. We are grateful to our partners, Labyrinth Bookstore, who are selling copies of the book for $24. Dana will share a copy of the direct link to Labyrinth's in the chat, but you can also go, there's a little button there. The room we are in is T-coil enabled. So if you have T-coil enabled devices, please feel free to switch them on at this time. To make the T-coil work, we ask everyone who's speaking to use a microphone. It is now my pleasure to introduce John Baxter, former Princeton Public Schools history teacher, who is writing his own book and who wrote the introduction for She Calls Herself Betsey Stockton, the Illustrated Odyssey of a Princeton Slave. We are delighted that he is here to introduce today's program. Please join me in welcoming John Baxter.
Thank you. Good afternoon. How do you introduce Connie Escher?
Shortly.
She gave me 2 sentences. But I do have some remarks that I have to share. I first met Connie shortly after I was hired to teach in the district. As probably many of you know, Connie runs the tour of Princeton for new hires in the district. And I remember that of the orientation program, that's the one thing that always has remained with me. Connie's obvious passion, love, pride of Princeton came through on that tour and stuck with me ever since. As luck would have it, I met her at the very beginning of my career, and then we ended up retiring in the same year. And somewhere along the course of the 20-odd years that we were both teaching, we became aware of each other's work and our research. And at that graduate or retirement ceremony, one of us said to the other, you know, we need to sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk. And we did that. And then we met and we met and we met, oftentimes upstairs on the second floor here in one of the study rooms, sharing our research, our discovery, supporting one another, giving each other drafts to read. Connie was always so amazingly generous. Thank you, Connie. It was wonderful. But over those years, what I learned was I was watching a very talented woman, a meticulous scholar, uncover and write about the work of another extraordinary woman, Betsey Stockton. And I came to believe that I was witnessing two soul sisters, Connie and Betsey. They seem to have so much in common in terms of dedication to community, dedication to education of the children of the community, particularly literacy. So it was an amazing journey for me to watch this book being written. And it seems to me today, it seems so fitting that a woman who needs no introduction to her Princeton community has written a biography reintroducing Princeton to one of its own, Betsey Stockton, a woman who walked these streets 200 years ago and who, like Connie, would have needed no introduction for very similar reasons. But this book is about more than that. Betsey Stockton's story is one of universal value and definitely one our country needs to know. Thank you for writing it, Connie. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to our dear friend, Connie, the author of She Calls Herself Betsey Stockton.
Well, it was more than 2 sentences, but my head can just fit near to talk to this microphone. It's more than magical. It's a dream come true to be here in this place I called my home away from home, Princeton Public Library, to celebrate the published life of this important American woman, Betsey Stockton. She found me at Bainbridge House when her daguerreotype fell out of a folder. And I just knew that I had to find out her complete biography. And my book, my book is the fourth and last published piece of her biography. And my central research quest was to find evidence about her life. And I did so in Spitalfields, London, the British Library, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, Nantucket, Mystic Seaport, Hawaii, and 3 libraries here in Princeton, and of course, the one that you're sitting in right now. I found the evidence for her life. What I found in Princeton Public Library, stay there, was this wonderful book just hanging out on the shelf, new purchases, and on page 181 was this picturing Frederick Douglass, his daguerreotype taken in the studio of Augustus Morand in Brooklyn, New York, on May 15th, 1863. The name of this studio rang a bell, and I looked at the reverse of Charles Samuel Stewart's own daguerreotype, which I'm going to show you. It's the lower one there. And I said, yep, this matches. So now I know where Stewart's was taken, and now I know an approximate date of when this portrait of Charles Samuel Stewart, an 1815 graduate of Princeton University, and Betsey Stockton's brother, missionary to Hawaii. And of course, then I said, probably Stockton went with him, traveled with him. They often traveled together. In fact, they traveled around the globe. So I started my first chapter looking at this single portrait of Betsey Stockton that I knew was the best artifact that I possibly could find about her. Her early life. Betsey Stockton was born on Constitution Hill. I'm going to go back, sorry, not to Richard Stockton, but to Robert Stockton, born in slavery to the slaveholder Robert Stockton, of a black enslaved mother and a white father there at Robert Stockton's plantation called Constitution Hill, Princeton. In the first or second chapter, Robert is quoted as writing a hasty letter to his son-in-law, Ashbel Green, to please return his, quote, Sealy, his property. And we hear the voice of a pregnant and terrified runaway slave at the end of the 18th century in Princeton. Bet's infancy and early childhood were captured in Green's diary entries, who, through marriage, owned Bet in Philadelphia and later in Princeton. Clearly, this naughty and bright girl child caught her owner's attention as he spent his and his son's time teaching her Presbyterian teachings and to read them and other books he ordered from Philadelphia booksellers. The evidence for Betsey Stockton's earliest literacy, younger than 6 years old, would play a huge part in her life goals. She decided she was a teacher and actually taught children in her teens. Because she was a girl, Bet, in her teens, could not attend Nassau Hall Grammar School, held in the basement of Nassau Hall. Let me see if I can find that slot here. There we are. Top one. So Green sold her time, still enslaved, to Reverend Nathaniel Todd at Woodbury, his school, New Jersey school, where she took on a kind of apprenticeship of nursing household chores for 3 years, for an unspecified amount of money. My question was, did she wear a slave badge? Those were badges which owners gave to their slaves as they sort of sold their time, still enslaved, but were not resident in the slaveholder's household. Well, Ashbel Green really understood this naughty and bright person, and so he did baptize Bet and verbally manumitted her, freed her, as she joined the First Presbyterian Church on Nassau Street. Uniquely, during this time, Stockton enjoyed special classes with students at the Princeton Theological Seminary. Michael Osborne, who with Green was to recommend Betsey Stockton to a missionary post sponsored by the ABCFM, that's American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions from Boston. And they wrote her a special contract, which she signed for this freed slave, so she would have papers on the watery leg of the Underground Railroad. By 1821, she was, quote, calling herself Betsey Stockton, meaning she took upon herself her own personhood, her own persona, her freedom, and saying to herself, here I am. The singularly literate freed slave who was about to become one of 3 whaleship journalists on this 158-day round, nonstop trip from New Haven to Honolulu. Let me see if I can find. Here's the world map. Yay! We're starting in New Haven, Connecticut, on the Thames. I'm just going to lead you through this map. New Haven, crossing the line ceremony with Father Neptune, the first ever American recording of that in 1823, and then the squall off of Rio de la Plata, which is the only picture of the Thames ever published. And then twice around the Horn, the wind blew them back from Tierra del Fuego a couple times, and then all on the way, shipboard birth of the Stewarts' young baby boy, mid-Pacific, where Stockton was acting as the midwife, and then on to Honolulu. And I have a picture here of the Thames. Here's the Thames, the upper picture of in the squall. People were, of course, extremely frightened during this storm, one of many horrific ones. And here on the top is a picture at Mystic Seaport of the Thames keel. 41 people lived on that ship for 158 days. That little wooden world. Remarkable that they made it. And in addition to a shipboard birth came a, I'm going to go back now, came a very interesting person who was not expected. And here comes a story within the story. You probably have heard of the Essex Tragedy, which after Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick, he went back to Nantucket and talked to the captain. Well, this young lad who was 19 when he boarded Betsey Stockton's ship was a constant reminder of the starvation and possible shipwreck of what they could go through. He was selected by his captain to murder and be the cannibal of his teenage friend, Owen Coffin of Nantucket. But instead of dread, this missionary company welcomed this 5'6" lad with sandy hair. He became a source of comfort for the missionaries as Stewart embraced and later published his desire to save Ramsdell as a Christian soul. Another part of Stockton's life came after the illness of Harriet Stewart. She was very delicate. She was a wonderful sister missionary of Stockton. Together they were on the Cleopatra's Barge, which was a ocean-going yacht built by the very, very strange but very, very wealthy Salem family, and was later purchased by the King of Hawaii. And it was used by Stockton and the missionaries for inter-island travel. So almost immediately after landing in Lahaina, Maui, Stockton began the first school for non-royal Hawaiians, a bilingual school using the language she had mastered, Hawaiian language, on board the Thames, apparently the only missionary in her company of 22 people to do so, which really underlines her ability as a linguist. Later, ill health forced Stockton and the Stewarts back to America via a 3-month stay in London and then on to New York City. The next whole part of Stockton's life was about schools. And this very lower image here, First Infant School in Green Street, means that Betsey Stockton had the brilliance to import the infant school system and used it in Philadelphia on number 60 Gaskell Street, Center City, Philadelphia, where African-American parents supported her with donated labor and cash to teach their children so successfully that they raised her salary almost immediately. And then a friend came, John Brown Russworm, there he is at the top, the first editor of the abolitionist newspaper, Freedom's Journal, the first African-American newspaper in America, based in New York City. His office was used as a kind of repository for Witherspoon's wonderful messages and actual teaching materials. In this case, Stockton was seeking a set of animal drawings. Those of you who teach art will understand that here is a model for hands-on learning. These children in this infant school for the colored, number 60 Gaskell Street, were 18 months to 7 years old. It was a brand new system. It had been used in the hellhole of Spitalfields, London, with success, and Stockton applied it. From Philadelphia, Stockton was then called to brave a very chilly trip on the Barge Canal with Methodist missionaries this time, Reverend Peter Jones, whose Ojibwa name I cannot pronounce, and Reverend William Case, who welcomed her to use this infant school method at a mission school on Grape Island, Upper Canada, near Kingston on Lake Ontario. Home to Princeton. From her earliest school kept by Stockton, about 1835, perhaps in the second story of what is now Copp's Cycle Shop, right around the corner from where you're sitting, she began an informal school, but then later in 1847, she was documented by the superintendent of school as the Princeton Township School, Common School. That means kids attended in common with each other. At district number 6, held in a wooden school building, which alas burned in 1870 as a larger Victorian school for her scholars was completed. And because their mother was in her grave and her father was at sea, she brought along Charlie Stewart, 12, Hattie Stewart, 10, Martha Stewart, 7, and served as both their mother and father because there was nobody else to take care of them except Stockton. And Stockton was professionally licensed and paid before the New Jersey State Normal School in Trenton opened its doors. I believe that was in 1858. But In that same year, Princeton published its first annual school report, the Township of Princeton, and even while the report praised the continuity and excellence of her work, they didn't mention her name. She lived first on Quarry Street, Princeton, during her years, and later, after 1860, the persons that she delivered, the baby boy she delivered in the Pacific, bought her a house and gave it to her that fronted on Witherspoon Street. So from 1860 to 1865, she lived in that house that she herself owned. In conclusion, Stockton turned many theories on the head of American life in the decades before the Civil War. Freed slaves in New York, Philadelphia, and Princeton were being taught by name, by age, in Stockton's school, and counted in the 1850 and 1860 census. Black literacy skyrocketed. And this idea of going to the heathen, in fact, Stockton brought literacy to Hawaiians and Ojibwa indigenous peoples, stabilizing their cultures at a critical time in their history. We hold her up as a matriarch, and we're leaving her head to head with her wonderful friend, Louis Mudge, reading, of course, in Latin, the Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars to prove that John C. Calhoun, who believed that if a Negro could read Greek, it would prove that Negroes were humans and had a soul. So Stockton and her others proved that, of course, they were very scholarly. So walking like a queen with her portly form and turban as she always wore it. Thank you for coming to this book launch at Princeton Public Library. I'm hoping to hold a book discussion group here later. And you have questions, I'm delighted to answer those. Thank you.
So if anyone has any questions from the audience in person, just raise your hand.
Don't be afraid. Yes.
Oh, wait,
Mrs. Fleming.
can you name any other individual, male or female, black or white, who had a life remotely as exciting and challenging and full of accomplishment as Betsey Stockton?
I can't.
I mean, the life of hers is stunning.
It's truly extraordinary. It's truly extraordinary. I'm humbled, frankly, by it. Very humbled. Yes, sir.
Connie, a couple of questions. First of all, is there any correspondence that you came across where she actually has been writing something of one sort or another? And secondly, was it an arduous task that you undertook? What were the most enjoyable aspects of it, and what were the least enjoyable aspects of it?
Okay, two questions in one. It's a twofer. Let me answer the first one first. She wrote this wonderful whaleship journal, and because Ashbel Green, who preached his last sermon in her church on Witherspoon Street, just really adored her, and he was kind of kicked out of the presidency of Princeton University, so he moved to Philadelphia. And what do you write about? Well, hey, you've got this prodigy on your hands. You raised her as a child. You freed her verbally. Why not put what she wrote into your newspaper, the Christian Advocate, which is what he did for several years. And he's sort of bragging, well, she never went to school, but got all of her knowledge in the household of a private family. Mine. So you understand his incredible pride, and he mentioned of African blood. She writes extremely well, and people really like her writing. So that's part of the first part of your answer to your question. And what was most enjoyable? Well, walking through Quaker Street and Spitalfields in London, and thinking about what her experience and what the experience of the person Witherspoon was to develop this infant school system at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution was extremely interesting, I found. I also enjoyed reading Ashbel Green's diaries. I enjoyed the visual aspects of finding evidence for her life as well, and thinking about you as readers as I put this together. What would the reader need to know? I mean, if you look at the bibliography, it's just thousands and thousands of pages of sources. But her love of her missionary brother and sister and these children that she adopted as her family was extremely fun to find out and to realize her commitment to these individuals in her life. I don't know if that completely answers your question. Miss Fran.
Just Greg. Oh, thank you. All right, mine is in maybe 3 parts. First of all,
I don't know if I can handle it, Fran.
You can.
I'll do my best.
First of all, actually, when you first introduced Princeton history to us, and to the teachers in Princeton, we had to learn a lot, and you brought all this information. That was my first time ever hearing of Betsey Stockton. And I may have said to you then that I went to school with Bobby Stockton, who was Robert Stockton, who was related to the Stockton family in Princeton, of course. But my question is, did you ever have any opportunity to speak with any of the Stocktons that are still around?
I have not. And Fran's family is a direct descendant by marriage to another Frances Craig that I found in the 1850 census. And I immediately called her and I said, oh my gosh, can you believe there is someone who was part of these wonderful families who sent their children to Betsey Stockton School. And I started, not completed it, but started a list of her students who, from the census, who went to school, who, and she had 40-some students sometimes in this one-room wooden school that unfortunately burned. And there's no pictures of it. What's the second part of your question?
Well, wait a minute, you probably answered it all by now.
I doubt it.
But seriously, we really appreciated everything that you brought to us, all the teachers, because we would not have known any of the Princeton history that you brought to us, and we certainly would not have known about Betsey Stockton. It's almost like hidden figures that it took many, many years, but we are finding out about people that we needed to know about. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks, Fran. I would like to stand next to her because she's so beautiful. I keep saying, models in New York City as opposed to a school teacher.
It's true.
It's true. It's true. Absolutely true.
When she came back to Princeton, did she connect with the Stockton family?
Which Stockton family? You mean with Robert, her former owner? She connected with, great question, Mr. Ruan Miller. She connected with Ashbel Green and was made a member of the Nassau Street Presbyterian Church in 1815, 16, 17, and was manumitted verbally by him. She did not, as far as I know, connect to her former, but this was the son-in-law of her former slave owner. Is that clear?
It is clear. I did talk to Bobby Stockton just recently. He knew quite well of Betsey Stockton. So
Great.
there might be some connection.
She had her hands full. I can't imagine bringing 3 little children, no electricity, no diapers, no running water, to Princeton in 1830s, 40s, while starting a school and being the principal of that school.
Microphone. Connie, could you move a little bit?
I'm sorry, I can't imagine coming back to Princeton in 1830s, 40s, and without running water, without Pampers, without lots of different things. And these little kids, they were out of diapers by then, but still 3 little kids who had witnessed the sadness of their mother dying from apparently a childhood illness that came back due to the incredibly difficult living conditions in Lahaina, Maui. I mean, a thatch roof cabin that leaked, and the mother was holding an infant for hours under an English umbrella because that was the only kinds of ways, for example, that's in the book, that she had to maintain. I think a lot of women died or buried their children in Hawaii in those early years, 1820s, 30s, because of malnutrition. Because the ABCFM didn't provide a huge salary, if any, missionaries were really kind of left to their own devices to trade or to buy certain food commodities. And many times they just had leftover ship's biscuits and tea and things as their main meal. And these women had many children there in Hawaii. So you can put it together and see this is probably a malnutrition situation, very hard on women.
Connie, did she have any involvement with the Abolition Movement, and did she have any contact with Frederick Douglass?
To my knowledge, she never did, except through this John Brown Russwurm, who, by the way, had an African slave mother and a white father, and the stepmother, and he was this newspaper editor of Freedom's Journal in New York City. He went to the Hebron Academy in Maine, and later was their first graduate of, I think it was Colby College. He was extremely literate, etc. But the stepmother said, "You called yourself John Russwurm. You can call yourself John Brown Russwurm." And there's now a national historic site there in Maine celebrating his work as the first African American newspaper in the United States of America, based in New York City. So other than that, I kept looking for other kinds of clues, Mary Jane, that would link her to the bigger events that were going on in her life. I think that her contribution was through education, and realized that how she was going to help all kinds of children, not just African American children in Princeton or indigenous children in Hawaii or in Upper Canada, but really had a variety of humanistic impulses. Yes, sir.
Did you discover any problems with the fact that her manumission was verbal and not written somewhere that perhaps would cause a problem in these extensive travels that
Well,
you undertook?
Great question. The question was, did she have any problems with traveling since her manumission had been verbal? That contract that was signed by Ashbel Green, a member of the ABCFM, by Stockton herself, were her papers. Everybody else was showing papers at these ports, and probably other places as well. But in the Underground Railroad, which happened on ships, we know through Mystic Seaport, Connecticut, we know that ships carried members, runaways on the Underground Railroad. And there were also, as you probably know, there were many seamen who were either African or other races that were on ships throughout the no. So the answer is that just that contract.
Connie, hi,
Hi, Mary.
I was struck by something you said at the end, that she helped to stabilize the culture in Hawaii. And I'm struck by that respect she had for indigenous culture as a missionary. Wondering if you could say a little bit more about that stabilizing the culture.
Because people said they were coming to, quote, save the heathen, but in actual fact, what they're doing was, especially begun by Stockton, starting to teach them their own language. Because she was bilingual herself, and later the ABCFM demanded that missionaries be bilingual before they set out. She was like such a pioneer about that. But she learned the Hawaiian language on board ship from returning Hawaiian youth who had been at the school, quote, for heathen youth in Cornwall, Connecticut. So this was part of a global, Alexander the Great had it first, but other people picked up this idea of a global humanity, and she was part of that. She was part of that. And that whole Ojibwa passage of her life was another example of bilingualism. I'm sure she learned rudimentary Ojibwa on this way from New York City with these missionaries, Methodist missionaries, on the way to the Barge Canal, which is now called the Erie Canal, to Lake Ontario. So this respect for indigenous cultures goes so far different from what we see about these horrible mission schools with all these graves today of people digging up little children and infants in both Canada and the United States of America, where they were going to be Americanized or Anglicized or whatever, changed, cut off their hair, teach them that their culture is terrible, etc. It's just Betsey Stockton did just the opposite of that, interestingly enough, and earlier too. Fran? I'm sorry.
All right, once Betsey Stockton came with the 3 children from Hawaii, did she keep them forever? Were they taken away, or do you know anything about that?
You mean the 3 Stewart children?
Yes.
They grew to, glad you asked that question. Charles Seaforth Stewart, the infant she delivered from the mother in the middle of the ocean, became the valedictorian at West Point in the famous class of 1846, where there were McClellans and general and so on and on and on. People who went into the Civil War and were incredible leaders. She sent Charlie to the Edge Hill School here in Princeton that was on Edge Hill and Mercer. It was a boys' preparatory school, girls could go. She probably homeschooled, use a terrible expression, the 2 younger girls as she was teaching, or they probably attended her school anyway, in Witherspoon Street school. Yeah, so she kept tabs and close contacts with their father, who went back to sea after this trip to Hawaii as a naval chaplain, and served on a ship called the Vincennes, and then another one, and toured the Pacific. I think he was very torn by his beautiful wife's early death, and Stockton was there to pick up the pieces, and she did beautifully. So I don't know if that answers your question. She kept in touch with them basically all of their natural lives. Yes, ma'am.
Connie, when I read your 1991 essay just today again, I was intrigued by the fact that the young teenage Betsey went to live with Mr. Todd for 3 or 5 years. And I'm wondering if Ashbel Green maybe sent her to get an education that she might not have been able to get in Princeton.
He sent her through the diaries, to answer your question, spot on. He sent her there because she couldn't go to Nassau Hall Grammar School. She was a girl. Horrors. he wanted her to have a better education. And there was both a Quaker school and Nathaniel Todd was like a master teacher. He ran the Mecklenburg, Pennsylvania Academy. So she not only had an academic education as like we would think of high school, but also she learned household management, she learned nursing, all of which came in really, really great and hand. So she almost had like a college graduation idea at the seminary. When you find out she's reading in Hebrew, these texts, and she's returning these categories of scriptures in writing. And as Michael Osborne says, she returned on vacation. She found time not only to read everything I assigned her, but she returns this in writing. This is due to early reading, early literacy, which she received at the hands of Ashbel Green and his sons. I don't know if that answers your question completely, but hi, Barbara.
Hi, Connie. I was wondering, when Betsey Stockton went to Hawaii, was the Bible translated into Hawaiian by then?
Great question. The people who Stockton was contemporary with began that amazing task. They had a Hawaiian to English and English to Hawaiian like primer, and she used that primer that was printed on a rudimentary hand letter press that like John Fleming's at his house there, and they just printed many things. But at the beginning, when she went, there was not that sense of the written language. It was a spoken language. In fact, she was responsible in her way for starting that revolution in literacy, which became just incredible, just like, flourished all through the different islands. And it was very difficult. Yeah, Barbara, does that answer your question?
Yeah, and also when she went to the indigenous people in Canada.
I think later there was a Ojibwa grammar that was published in the 1830s. She went there very briefly in the summer of June 1829. One of the helpful things I think that I was thinking about readers when I wrote this was a complete chronology, which took me years to put together, to really substantiate where she was and what she was doing at a particular time, and then these other questions for discussion. But Ms. Satterfield, did you have a question?
Yes, I did.
I'm honored by your presence. Could we please give a nice clap for Shirley Satterfield? Please.
I just want to thank you for bringing Betsey Stockton to life. I call her Elizabeth because that's her given name. But I see on the wall, you have our church, the church window that's dedicated to Elizabeth Stockton. Hi, Lord.
I sure do.
Yeah,
It's right there, that
by
stained
her
glass.
scholars, and she started a Sabbath school in our church.
That's,
And also there's a plaque.
Can we have the screen lit up again, please?
Oh, I think it just turned off.
Okay, shall I go on?
Yes.
Oh, okay. There's also a plaque, and in the 90s, I don't know when in the 90s, but the Historic Society of New Jersey has a trail of noted women throughout New Jersey, and one is Betsey Stockton, and I wrote it, and there's a plaque in front of our church dedicated to her.
I know.
And also there's a picture in the Theological Seminary that was commissioned by our church, by someone who did it for our 190th anniversary. So I want to thank you for bringing Betsey Stockton to life and for coming to talk to me, because we did a lot of talking about Betsey Stockton.
You helped me enormously. And yeah, there is that stained glass. Thank you very,
Yes.
very much, Becca. That beautiful stained glass. And this plaque I wrote about as the final tribute to her matriarch years that was installed in your church. And the last chapter is a kind of refreshment, reiteration of her incredible life by people who knew her, by Mudge and Woodhull. Was published in 1906 in the Princeton Press. And they installed that beautiful bronze plaque there as well.
Yeah, so if you come to Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, you'll see 3 honors to Betsey Stockton. Also, I'd like to tell a story. Can I tell something?
Please.
When my daughter was going to Syracuse University for graduate school, I went to Albany, New York to see the homestead of Harriet Tubman. I took a friend, many of you may know Mamie Oldham, I know that Frances does, so she went with me. And on her way back, I said, let's stop at Cooperstown to find out where Betsey Stockton is buried. And they really didn't want to do this.
Why?
So I went to Cooperstown, where they talk about the Cooperstown, what is it, the
Baseball Hall of
Fame. And I said, could you tell me where the cemeteries are where Betsey Stockton is buried? And they looked at me like I was crazy. And they said, well, there are 3 cemeteries. So we were riding along, and I saw these men, I think they were on a fire truck. I said, do you know what the cemetery is? By this time, they were really angry with me. So I finally got to a cemetery, and there was a woman who was petting her cat, and she was a caregiver. And I said, is Betsey Stockton buried here? She said, I don't know, but some woman came several years ago looking for Betsey Stockton. If she's here, she's somewhere up there. Now, there's thousands of tombs up there. And I said, well, let's go and look for Betsey Stockton. By this time, they really are angry with me. Within 10 minutes, I walked right up to her tombstone.
There you go.
And she's buried right next to the Stewarts.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a big tombstone that talks about her life, and she was born in Princeton.
Absolutely.
So that's my story about it.
Well, thank you. I can't believe they were angry with you, but as usual, you stuck to your purpose. It's incredible. But again, this part of American history, instead of just reading about this, that, and the other white supremacists, I think we can take a look at people who overcame poverty, gender preference, racism, and instilled literacy. I can't believe America can't figure out, shelter, literacy, food. Hello. It's not that difficult to understand what the basic needs of all of our citizens are. But thank you so much for telling us this.
Thank
More questions? No.
Thank you so, oh, sorry, did you want to say something? Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
For this wonderful talk. We were so happy to be able to welcome you to the library, where we get to see you, having been, you've been working on this for so long, and to get to see it in print is a gift, and it's been a joy to have you here this afternoon. I'll be curious to see what other historical figures jump out from the shelves to have you tell their story.
Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you for coming.